Silas Dorn was the perfect son. Ezra and Lillian Dorn had raised him with love, discipline, and every opportunity a child could need. He was intelligent, well-mannered, and driven, a young man destined for success. But when the FBI arrived at their doorstep with a warrant and a chilling accusation, their world shattered. Their son wasn't just missing. He was the most wanted killer in America. Sure, here's the expanded version of Chapter 1. Silas Dorn was the kind of son every parent dreamed of. Growing up in the quiet town of Bluefield, he was polite, intelligent, and well-liked by neighbors. His parents, Ezra and Lillian Dorn, took great pride in their only child. He excelled in school, played baseball, and volunteered at the local shelter. He was never in trouble, never gave them reason to worry. To everyone who knew him, Silas was just another young man with a bright future ahead of him. But all of that changed on a cold autumn morning when the past came knocking on their door. Ezra was outside trimming the hedges when he noticed the black SUVs pulling up in front of their home. At first, he assumed there had been some mistake, maybe an accident in the neighborhood, or perhaps they were looking for someone else. But when several agents in dark suits stepped out and approached the house with grim expressions, a deep sense of unease settled over him. Lillian, who had been tending to her roses, wiped her hands on her apron and stood frozen, watching as the officers made their way toward them. One of the agents, a tall man with a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped forward and flashed his badge. FBI. Ezra's stomach tightened. Before he could speak, the agent asked a question that sent a chill down his spine. Mr. Dorn, Mrs. Dorn, when was the last time you saw your son? Silas had left for college nearly a year ago. He attended a university a few states over and only visited during holidays. The last time they had seen him was about 3 months prior during a weekend visit. He had seemed fine, normal even. Nothing about him had raised any alarm. Lillian, visibly shaken, repeated this information to the agent, her voice barely above a whisper. The agent exchanged a glance with his colleagues before pulling out a manila folder. He opened it and handed them a photograph. Ezra and Lillian stared at the image in disbelief. The grainy security footage showed a masked figure stepping out of a convenience store, a long, dark jacket hanging from his frame. The hood was partially down, revealing a glimpse of the man's face. There were smudges of what looked like blood on his sleeve. The agent didn't need to say anything else. Ezra and Lillian knew exactly what they were looking at. Lillian shook her head violently. No, she muttered, stepping back as if the photo itself was something poisonous. That's not Silas. There has to be a mistake. The agent's voice remained calm but firm. I'm afraid it's not a mistake, ma'am. We have DNA evidence linking him to multiple crime scenes. Your son is a wanted fugitive. The words barely registered. The world around them seemed to tilt. Ezra gripped the porch railing, his breath shallow. This was impossible. Silas wasn't a criminal. He was their son. But the nightmare was only just beginning. The name Orion Killer had become synonymous with fear. Over the past 2 years, the elusive murderer had left a trail of bodies across multiple states, each crime more brutal than the last. The victims, always young men between the ages of 20 and 30, had been found with strange carvings on their bodies, an unmistakable signature that had baffled investigators. The markings formed a star pattern, later identified as the Orion constellation. It was this chilling detail that led to the media branding him the Orion Killer, a name that struck terror across the country. The FBI had been hunting him for over a year, piecing together fragments of evidence from different crime scenes. Each murder had been methodical, calculated, with no clear pattern in victim selection beyond their demographic. Some had been students, others drifters, a few working professionals. None of them seemed to have any connection, making it nearly impossible to predict where he would strike next. The only thing investigators knew for certain was that he was growing bolder. The intervals between killings had begun to shorten, and his methods had become more elaborate, almost ritualistic. Ezra and Lillian Dorn listened in stunned silence as the agents explained their findings. Every fiber of their being rejected what they were hearing. Their Silas a serial killer? It was inconceivable. Lillian clutched her husband's arm, her fingers trembling as the agents continued to speak, laying out their case piece by piece. The fingerprints had been the first break in the case. A partial print had been lifted from the scene of the most recent murder, one that matched a record in an old database. The print belonged to none other than Silas Dorn, who had once been fingerprinted as part of a summer internship program in high school. At first, investigators had thought it was a mistake, a coincidence, but further analysis confirmed it. His DNA had been recovered from multiple crime scenes, and security footage placed him in several of the cities where the murders had occurred. It was irrefutable. Ezra felt a deep pit form in his stomach. Memories flashed through his mind, moments that now seemed darker in hindsight. He had always known Silas to be reserved, but had he missed something more sinister? He thought back to his son's childhood, the times he had wandered off alone for hours, returning home with vague explanations. He remembered a summer trip when Silas had been caught dissecting small animals in the backyard, claiming it was for science. Ezra had laughed it off at the time. Now, he wasn't so sure. The agent's words kept replaying in his head. Your son is one of the most wanted men in America. But there was one detail that made it even worse. Silas had vanished. He had been under quiet surveillance for weeks before the FBI made their move, but he must have sensed something. By the time they were ready to apprehend him, he was already gone. No credit card activity, no cell phone signal. It was as if he had disappeared into thin air. Ezra and Lillian were left with a horrifying truth. Their son was not just missing, he was running. Days passed in a haze of disbelief and fear. Ezra and Lillian could barely sleep, haunted by the possibility that their son was capable of the horrors the FBI had described. The once warm and welcoming atmosphere of their home now felt cold, tainted by the shadow of suspicion. Silas had spent his entire childhood in this house, and now every room, every memory, felt like it was hiding a secret. Desperate for answers, they started searching through his old belongings. His bedroom had remained mostly untouched since he left for college, but now they examined it with fresh eyes, looking for anything that might prove his innocence or confirm his guilt. At first, nothing seemed out of place. His books were neatly arranged, old baseball trophies gathered dust on the shelves, and his childhood drawings were still pinned to the corkboard. It was the room of a normal young man. But then they found the attic key. The attic had always been a storage space, filled with holiday decorations and boxes of forgotten keepsakes. Silas had no reason to go up there, yet something deep in Ezra's gut told him they needed to look. As he pulled down the ladder and climbed up, the air turned thick with dust, and the dim light from a single hanging bulb cast long shadows. Lillian followed hesitantly, clutching her sweater around her as if bracing for something terrible. At first, there was nothing unusual, just old boxes stacked against the walls, but as they moved deeper into the space, Ezra's foot bumped against something heavy. A trunk shoved into the farthest corner, locked with a small rusted latch. His hands trembled as he unfastened it, his breath hitching in his throat. When he finally lifted the lid, the sight before them sent a shiver through his entire body. Inside were neatly arranged newspaper clippings, each one detailing the Orion killer's murders. Some were yellowed with age, dating back to the earliest killings, while others were fresh, as if they had been collected recently. Maps were tucked underneath, marked with red circles and notes scribbled in an eerily familiar handwriting. Lillian gasped as she picked up one of the papers, her fingers tightening around it as realization set in. And then they found the metal box. It was small, about the size of a lunch tin and heavier than it should have been. Lillian hesitated before flipping the latch. The moment she opened it, bile rose in her throat. Inside were trophies, small, seemingly insignificant objects that had once belonged to the victims. A wristwatch, a dog tag, a keychain, a lock of hair. Ezra's knees buckled, and he had to steady himself against a beam. His son had been keeping souvenirs from his crimes. But the worst discovery lay beneath everything else. A single photograph, one that had been taken from outside their own home. Silas had been watching them, and they had never even noticed. The FBI wasted no time securing the Dorn household. Agents swarmed the property, setting up surveillance and combing through every inch of the attic, cataloging the disturbing evidence Ezra and Lillian had uncovered. The reality was inescapable now. Silas was not just the prime suspect in the Orion killer case. He was the killer. Despite the overwhelming proof, Lillian struggled to accept it. She sat motionless in the living room, her hands clasped together as if in silent prayer. She kept replaying moments from Silas's childhood, searching for any sign she had missed. The laughter at the dinner table, the birthday parties, the late-night conversations about his dreams and ambitions. How could the same boy who once held her hand when he was scared have grown into something so unrecognizable? Ezra, however, felt something beyond sorrow. Guilt. He had dismissed so many things over the years, little oddities that he now realized weren't so little. The way Silas rarely showed emotion, the way he always seemed to be observing rather than participating, as if studying the people around him. The attic trunk was proof that this darkness had been inside him for longer than anyone had known. And now he was still out there. The FBI had suspected he might return to his childhood home, which is why they stationed agents around the perimeter. But for weeks there was nothing, no sign of him. Then, one night, everything changed. It started with the alarm. At exactly 3:12 a.m., the security system blared through the house, jolting Ezra and Lillian awake. Agents stationed outside rushed toward the perimeter, scanning the property with flashlights and weapons drawn. The back door had been forced open, but nothing inside seemed disturbed. The attic remained untouched. Silas hadn't come for the trunk. Instead, he had left something behind. A single note, placed carefully on the kitchen table. "I know you found it. I'll see you soon." The words sent ice through Ezra's veins. This wasn't a plea for innocence or an attempt to explain. It was a promise, a warning. From that moment, the hunt for Silas escalated. His face was plastered across every news channel, his name spoken in hushed, fearful tones. The FBI expanded their search, tracking down every lead, but he was always one step ahead. Surveillance footage showed glimpses of him, a blurry figure at a gas station, a fleeting shadow outside a motel, but every time agents arrived, he was already gone. It was as if he had perfected the art of disappearing. Then, a breakthrough. A former classmate received a cryptic message. Authorities traced the number, but it was a burner phone. The message, however, was unmistakable. "Orion will shine brightest one last time." The FBI knew what it meant. Silas was planning something final, something bigger. The only question was who his last victim would be. The message was a taunt, a final riddle left behind by a man who had spent years evading justice. The FBI analyzed every word, every possible meaning, trying to anticipate his next move. Orion had always been his signature, his mark, but now it had become his final declaration. He was planning one last act, and then it would all be over. The urgency in the investigation reached a fever pitch. After days of chasing false leads, investigators finally got their break. Surveillance footage from a remote gas station in the Appalachian foothills caught Silas's reflection in the window. He was wearing a dark hoodie, his face partially obscured, but it was unmistakably him. He had bought food, bottled water, and a map. One of the locations circled on the map was an abandoned observatory just outside of a small town. The name struck the agents instantly: Orion. They moved quickly, deploying a tactical team to the location. The observatory, long forgotten by the town, stood alone atop a hill, its skeletal dome looming under the night sky. The windows were shattered, the air thick with dust and decay. The agents approached cautiously, weapons drawn, scanning for movement. Inside, the scene was eerily staged. Candles flickered along the walls, casting elongated shadows that danced across the dusty floors. In the center of the room stood Silas, waiting. He didn't run, didn't resist. He simply stood there, hands at his sides, a faint smile on his lips. The lead agent issued commands, his voice firm and unwavering. "Silas Dorn, you're under arrest." Silas tilted his head slightly, as if amused by the moment. He didn't fight. He didn't try to flee. Instead, he whispered something under his breath, words too soft for the agents to hear. Then, without hesitation, he reached into his pocket and swallowed something. The agents rushed forward, tackling him to the ground, but it was too late. His body convulsed violently, foam bubbling at the corners of his mouth. The poison worked quickly, his breaths becoming shallow, his eyes glassy. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but there was nothing they could do. The Orion killer was dead. The case was closed, but for Ezra and Lillian Dorn, there was no sense of relief, no victory. Their son had been caught, but the horror of what he had done could never be erased. Their once loving child had become something unrecognizable, a name that would forever be etched in the annals of true crime history. Months later, they packed up their home, unable to bear the weight of the memories that lingered within its walls. But even as they tried to move on, a lingering unease remained. Some nights, when the wind howled through the trees, Lillian swore she could still feel him watching. The shadow of Orion had faded, but it had never truly disappeared.